Hello, my name is Halim Labi, and it is a pleasure to be able to present the introductions. Thank you for taking the time to put yourself in spaces that might seem uncomfortable so that we might have an honest conversation about reform. We often talk about taking the actionable steps necessary to combat systemic racism without addressing pragmatic tools necessary to do the work, which is why it is such a pleasure to have Mr. Cumberbatch here with us today to address policing in America. It is also a pleasure to introduce Karen Proctor and Clark Strickland. 213A background. Sewanee's 213A Leaders program cultivates leaders able to drive positive change in their lives and in out the world. The program honors the legacy of Houston Roberson, PhD, Sewanee's first tenured African-American professor, an exemplary historian, and a mentor to students and colleagues. 213A provides students from diverse backgrounds with a platform for rigorous educational advancement, professional preparation, and deep exploration of their personal commitment to civic action and social justice. The NAACP background. Founded in 1909 in response to the ongoing violence against Black people around the country, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is the largest and most preemptive civil rights organization in the nation. The NAACP's mission is to secure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure the health and well-being of all persons. The University of the South NAACP unit was first established in 2019. Clark Strickland is an American Studies major with a minor in African American Studies at the University of the South. Originally from Chattanooga, Tennessee, Clark is passionate about fostering inclusive spaces that empower marginalized communities, especially in the Deep South. This passion is embodied by her work as the Vice President and Charter Member for the Youth and College Division Unit of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People at the University of the South. Karen Proctor works with leaders in all sectors to design lasting solutions for positive change. In 2016, she was awarded the Brown Foundation Teaching Fellowship at the university in her role as Special Assistant to the Provost. She also works with the university on leadership, development, and social impact initiatives, providing oversight for the Office of Civic Engagement and the Center for Leadership. Her accomplished career has devoted to work across the public and private sectors to address issues ranging from hunger to school reform.
Khalil, thank you so much for that introduction and welcome everyone to this conversation on a social justice perspective on policing. I want to give a little bit of background about this conversation today, give you a little bit of context in terms of also what we're going to do. We're going to give a little bit of context to what the conversation is about. Then we're going to engage our guest, Mr. Khalil Cumberbatch, in a conversation as he offers his perspective on social justice and policing. We'll take your questions towards the end of that conversation, and then we'll wrap it up and tell you where the 213A leaders and NAACP are going next. But I want to start us almost a year ago, May 2020. We're in the midst of a burgeoning pandemic. The city of Minneapolis and the country were confronted with that horrifying video of the last moments of George Floyd's life. We all became part of a public witness to the imperative to address police violence in this country. For a moment there was seemingly a groundswell of belief across the country that policing needed an overhaul. But here we are, nearly 11 months later, and we're still dealing with the tumult over policing issues that continues. We're wrapped tightly in local, state, and national political and cultural rhetoric around policing and what needs to be done. And the timing would have it that this week, the nation's attention is once again turned to Minneapolis, to the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, the former police officer charged with second and third degree murder for Mr. Floyd's death. So in Minneapolis and elsewhere, according to reporting by John Elligan and Tim Arango from the New York Times, and I'm quoting from them, this struggle over what to do to overhaul policing and how to do it has left our country fractured and has left us with a fractured public discourse about policing, the role of police, and what does it all mean for public safety. So our conversation tonight, a social justice perspective on policing in America, is exactly that. It's a conversation. It's a conversation with someone who has dedicated and devoted his life to issues of social reform and criminal justice reform. Khalil Cumberbatch is a senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice, and Clark will give more of his bio in a minute. But he lives what he talks about. He's knowledgeable, but he also leans into that lived experience. We're going to lean on that tonight to have a conversation about where we're going as a country. And we're going to acknowledge that there are many different kinds of perspectives on policing in America. The topic is fraught with politics, with race, with issues that deal with socioeconomic issues. And it's often caught up in the emotional turmoil from fresh tragedies that frankly feel more like social devolution than evolution. But that's why the 213A leaders and the NAACP unit, two organizations on campus that are really devoted to bringing social justice to our campus community and to the country, we see it as our role to offer a conversation that allows us to look at the lens of social justice on this very important issue. A couple of quick points to make about the conversation tonight. It's a conversation. It's not a debate. As moderators, Clark and I are here to really move the conversation forward. And as I said, lean in to Mr. Cumberbatch's knowledge and his experience in this space. Our agenda is simple. We want to gain an understanding and a perspective on social justice. And frankly, that's not the conversation that's happening in media and in a lot of our public square. It's argumentative, and that's not what we're doing tonight. We're really going to listen and to learn. We hope to raise more questions actually than we can answer. And whether we choose to believe it or not, this is an important conversation because we all play a role, explicitly, directly, or complicitly, with shaping our country. So a couple things very quickly. Our aim is to get on the same page with terminology, to understand the historical roots of the issue, to consider pathways forward, and then to engage you with questions and answers. So be prepared for that. But what we want to start with is a video that allows us to get a little bit of history on policing in the United States, and decidedly and intentionally from the point of view of how policing has affected Black, Indigenous people of color. So Nikki, if you can show that video.
Hi, I'm Randa Abdel Fattah.
And I'm Ramteen Arab Louis.
Context to the police killing of George Floyd and so many other Black people in this country. This week, we're bringing you the deep history of policing in America.
We wanted to understand how the relationship between police and the Black community had evolved to one so bloody and tragic.
So we reached out to this historian.
My name's Khalil Muhammad. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School.
In his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Khalil lays out a historical argument for how Black people have been criminalized over the past 400 years in the US. And he does that by telling parallel narratives about the history of policing in the North and the South. These stories share one key feature: the use of brutal force to control Black Americans.
Policing in America started in the mid-1600s with the Boston Watch, essentially a neighborhood watch group. But some of the first police forces in the South were created to control enslaved Black people. They would come to be known as slave patrols. Almost all white men had to serve in these patrols.
Their duties were written into law, like the slave patrol statute from Louisiana in 1835.
Arrest any slave or slaves, whether with or without a permit, who may be caught in the woods or forest with any fire or torch, which slave or slaves thus arrested shall be subjected to corporal punishment not exceeding 30 stripes. So the tying together early on, the surveillance, the deputization essentially of all white men to be police officers, and then to dispense corporal punishment on the scene are all baked in from the very beginning.
The Civil War eventually brought an end to slavery in America. But for most Black people in the South, it didn't fundamentally change their lives.
And by the early 20th century, the KKK would emerge to enforce control over Black citizens in the South. And this pushed millions of Black citizens to flee to northern, progressive cities as part of what would become known as the Great Migration.
Police officers receive African-American migrants in the same way that their white neighbors and community peers did, which is with contempt and hostility. When a white person throws a Molotov cocktail into a new Black homeowner on a street that had previously been all Irish or all Polish or all German, the police come and they arrest the Black family and defend the white mob. And this happens time and time, over and over again. They are policing the racial norms of white supremacy from the very beginning in the North.
Black skin becomes equated with criminality.
And according to Khalil Muhammad, the system hasn't fundamentally changed since then. He says that pointing out the problem is clearly not sufficient to fix the system.
Because the problem has been known for a century. The evidence has been presented for a century. The recommendations for change, for holding police officers accountable, for charging them with criminal offenses when they behave criminally. It's a century of the same story playing out over and over again. It seems to me that's what's possible, is recognizing that police officers and police agencies are incapable of fixing themselves. And so the question that has to be asked in the wake of George Floyd, and I think this question is being asked and answered by more white people than I've seen in my lifetime, is, do white people in America still want the police to protect their interests over the rights and dignity and lives of Black, and in too many cases, brown, indigenous, and Asian populations in this country?
Our whole country is waiting to hear the answer to that question. That was historian Khalil Muhammad. I'm Ramteen Arablouei.
I'm Randa Abdel Fattah. You can listen to this full episode of NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts and at npr.org/throughline.
Nikki, thank you for showing that. I'm going to give you a moment to get the PowerPoint back up. Before we begin, we also want to just define our terms a little bit, because I think in my experience in working with organizations across the country on diversity inclusion efforts, a lot of times we start talking about things, but we are using terminology and terms that we're all not on the same page with. So we want to go over some of that terminology just so that you're clear about what we're talking about. When we're saying social justice, and which you're going to hear again and again, we're talking about justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. And so we are seeing social justice as defined by Bell as both a process and a goal. And the goal of social justice, and I'm quoting from Bell's research here, is full and equal participation of all groups in a society. Participation that's mutually shaped to meet everyone's needs. And this includes a vision of society in which the distribution of resources is equitable and all members have the opportunity to live psychologically and physically safe and secure. When we're talking about racism, another term that gets bandied about without sort of a through line of what we're actually talking about, we're talking about the combination of individual prejudice and individual discrimination on the one hand, but also institutional policies and practices on the other hand that result in the unjustified negative treatment and subordination of members of racial or ethnic groups. And there's a history there that becomes important. So we appreciate the research by Pine and Hilliard there. When we're talking about structural racism, it's that definition of racism that is embodied in our systems, in our culture. It's internalized, it's historical, and it exists in the places where we work, the places where we live, the places where we play, where we shop, where we go to the hospital. It exists in every facet of society. And sociologist Joe Fagan has a lot to talk about how racialized our society has become, almost to the point where it is just our way of life. And when we talk about oppression, we're talking about a system that maintains advantages and disadvantages based on social group membership. And when we talk about police, we're talking about a body of officers, civil servants that represent the civil authority of government. They're responsible typically for maintaining public order and social safety. And so that's the way what we're gonna get ourselves on the same page. And now I'm gonna turn it over to Clark to please introduce our guest, Mr. Cumberbatch.
Thank you so much, Professor Proctor. Good evening. Tonight, I have been afforded the great privilege of introducing tonight's speaker, Mr. Khalil Cumberbatch, father, husband, and advocate. Khalil A. Cumberbatch is a nationally recognized, formerly incarcerated advocate for criminal justice and deportation policy change. His advocacy work began in 2010, shortly after his release from serving almost 7 years in the New York State prison system. Khalil currently serves as a senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice. Most recently, he served as chief strategist at New Yorkers United for Justice, where he maintains the role of senior advisor. Prior to his work at the New Yorkers United for Justice, he served as Associate Vice President of Policy at the Fortune Society, a reentry organization whose goal is to build up people and not prisons. He is also a lecturer at Columbia University's School of Social Work, the nation's oldest school of social work with roots extending back to 1898. Khalil graduated from City University of New York City's Herbert Lehman College's Master's in Social Work program in May of 2014, where he was awarded the Urban Justice Award for his work with underserved and marginalized communities that are negatively impacted by mass incarceration as well as poverty, high unemployment rates, lack of access to quality education, and other ineffective social safety nets. In 2014, Khalil was one of 2 recipients to receive an executive pardon from the New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo to prevent his deportation from the United States. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Khalil Cumberbatch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clark, and thank you, Professor Proctor and the staff and the other students who just made this process completely seamless to sit in front of you and to be able to give my thoughts on this topic. I will say that it is very hard to follow Khalil Gibran Muhammad, but I will try my best. He is a colleague and a friend, and when I read his book for the first time, while I was in immigration detention, it completely changed my perspective on not only how the criminalization of Black men and Black boys in particular, but also he lays out in his book the criminalization of immigrants as well, and how there is a deep connection between the way that this country has treated Black and brown folks, but also folks who at one point have been given the title of immigrant. So as mentioned, my name is Khalil Cumberbatch. I currently work at an organization called the Council on Criminal Justice, which is a think tank and policy organization whose goal is to basically be the center of gravity in a conversation around criminal justice reform. I've been there since August of last year. And really and truly, I think that it is an opportunity in a very, unfortunately, deeply polarized time in our country to really try to hold a piece of the ground that is very hard to hold, which is the middle, which is to say that folks on the left and the right all have a role to play in getting us out of mass incarceration, mass deportation, other social justice ills. And there has to be an entity that's going to hold the space in order for them to do that. I come to this work about criminal justice reform and to achieve social justice because of my own injustices and because of my own oppression. As Clark mentioned in my bio, I served almost 6.5 years in the New York State prison system for a robbery in the first degree, a criminal act that I committed as a very young man. I was 20 years old when I committed that act, and it had initially, because of that crime, been given an 11-year prison sentence. And so here I was as a 21-year-old male entering into the prison system with a prison sentence that was longer than half of my life that I had lived up until that point. And although I was 21 years old, I was very much still a child in the way that I interacted with society. More importantly, I didn't quite fully understand my role as a young man, but also as a young man of color in helping to build my community, helping to be an asset to my community as opposed to a liability. And so as I entered into the prison system in New York State, I ultimately ended up in a maximum security prison named Greenhaven. And unbeknownst to me at the time, Greenhaven was one of the many facilities that had benefited greatly because of the September 1971 Attica Rebellion, where unfortunately men had lost their lives, both incarcerated men and correctional officers, at the hands of state officials. And out of that predicament came many programs and many reforms within the correctional system that I personally benefited from. And one of those was the ability to engage in programs that were designed and implemented and ran by men who were incarcerated for men who were incarcerated. And as a young man, trying to figure out not only how I was going to survive prison, but more importantly, what I was going to do after my prison sentence was over. One of the many things I learned very quickly in a maximum security prison is that an 11-year sentence is not that long. I was around men who had been given 25 to life sentences, 50 to life sentences, 100 to life sentences, and these are years, by the way. And at one point, my neighbor, who was only a couple years older than me, had a 999-year sentence. And so as a young man, he knew he was going to die in prison unless there was some legal remedy that was going to allow him to return to society. And so you don't complain very, very much about 11 years. More importantly, you start to prepare yourself for your release. And it was during my incarceration that I was exposed to programs that really forced me to have a level of introspection that up until that point in my life, unfortunately, I had not been forced to do. And one of the kind of key reflection points that I always talk about during my incarceration was my interaction with a gentleman named Chico. And this was about a year into my incarceration. And one day on the tier, which is the kind of area that's in front of the cells, but they generally, whenever they let you out of a cell, this is where people kind of congregate. And on this day, my cellmate and myself were cleaning out our cell. And while my cellmate was in the cell, I was standing on the tier, and Chico came up to me. He was an older man than I. He was working at a program called the Youth Assistance Program. And he said to me that, as a program that was designed for youth to come into the facility and have conversations with incarcerated men, that there were not very many youth in that program. There were no young men to sit down with the youth, and they recognized this as a liability, and they were trying to recruit younger men. And so, as a very young man who had a ton of chips on my shoulder, not just one of them being an unhealthy relationship with my father at the time, I viewed Chico like I viewed almost every other older man than I, which is, someone trying to be my father. He's trying to, he's trying to school me. He's trying to teach me. And because I was ignorant at the time, I basically turned that down. And in the process of doing that, Chico realized that I was being abrasive, and he realized that I wasn't open to the opportunity. And so he said to me, all right, I understand that you may need some time to think, but this is what you really need to think about. Do you want to continue to be a part of the problem, or do you want to be a part of the solution? And at the time, it really didn't land on me, the depth of the statement. It wasn't until later, upon further reflection, that I realized that that I was not part of the solution. I didn't know, and I couldn't place to what extent at that point I had been a part of the problem, but I knew for a fact I was not a part of the solution. And the only person that I could really think about at the time was my mother, because I could not articulate to her the things that I had done up until that point in my life that I knew were a part of the problem, but did them anyway, knowing that she raised me to be a very different person. And so I was intrigued at this process of kind of peeling back the onion of who I was, who I wanted to be, and really stripping away some of the false notions that I was given as a young man growing up in a very tough neighborhood, which is South Jamaica, Queens. And so during my incarceration, I spent almost my entire 6 years really rebuilding myself, stripping down to the bone who I thought I was, who I was going to be, and really kind of replacing those bricks with ones that I had molded and created while incarcerated. And so upon my release, I basically wanted to do two things. One is I wanted to not go back to prison. I realized that the abilities and the contributions that I could make to society were better suited for me to be in society and not incarcerated. More importantly, I could not go back to prison and look the men in the eye who had mentored me and who had really helped me build myself, and tell them that I had failed them. As a matter of fact, they made it very clear to me that if I came back, I would not be welcome with open arms, because I had a chance, where as many of them did not. And two, I really wanted to rebuild a legacy for myself. I knew at one point that in my life, I would have to talk to my children about the decisions I had made as a young man. And I did not want them to only know about my incarceration. I wanted them to know that incarceration and the decisions that I made to lead up to my incarceration were just a part of who their father was. And so with those two key commitments to myself and to my family, I moved forward in my reentry and did all of the things that I think that most people want to do, which is successfully complete parole to get off of supervision. I was I had completed a undergraduate degree and went right into a graduate program. I had been working full time. I met my wife, and we, got married. We started a family, and was 1 week away from a master's. I was, almost at the precipice of an accomplishment that I had dreamt about during not only during my incarceration, but for the 4 years after that incarceration leading up to this moment. And then in May of 2014, Immigration Customs Enforcement came to my home to arrest me and ultimately tried to deport me back to my birth country of Guyana. As Clark mentioned in my bio, December of 2014, I had received executive pardon from our now Governor Andrew Cuomo to largely relieve the immigration consequences of my criminal conviction. But that was before I spent 5.5 months in immigration detention. And it was really, it was really the hardest kind of trek of my journey because I had a family at the time. I had 2 young children, and they were really, suffering because of decisions that I had made as a young man. And so I was at this other moment of my life, this other watershed moment, where I realized that there was some deep introspection that needed to happen, and I needed to make new commitments to myself and to my family if I was to get out of that situation, because it wasn't very clear that I would get out of it. And so the key commitment that I made was to be more vocal about my journey, to be an advocate not only for criminal justice reform, but also for substantial immigration reform. And that is not only referring to folks who are undocumented, but for folks who are documented, who have been convicted of crimes, whether they are guilty of them or not. And so now, that kind of, a journey has led me here to really be an outspoken advocate, someone who talks about issues that come from incarceration, but also issues that lead to incarceration. And, hence the subject tonight. I don't think that when we talk about policing in this country, that I think we could not have a conversation about race, not have a conversation about gender, not have a conversation about brutality. The reality is, as Khalil laid out in his interview, is that the modern day notion of policing, unfortunately, its roots are grounded in chattel slavery, in the brutality of Black and brown folks for hundreds of years. He actually said that the issue of police accountability, the issue of policing and the way that they engage with Black and brown communities is a century-old problem. Many people would argue and say it's actually older than that. And so we can't talk about issues of policing without acknowledging some of those key components. But also we can't talk about policing in a silo. The reality is that we need to figure out a very clear path forward to how we will actually have an entity in communities that brings safety and justice. Now, that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to have policing in communities. What that means is that we need to be bold as a country, and we really need to hit a moment where we realize that boldness is going to require some chance taking. And what that means is that there needs to be some programs that are allowed to grow and develop, many of which are growing across inner cities all across this country. And that we need to allow those programs to have the ability to replace what we know as policing. So I'll stop there because I know that this is a moderated conversation, but thank you for allowing me to give some thoughts as an intro.
No, thank you for those thoughts, Khalil. They're important, and we're going to get into some of the detail in a moment. I know Clark wants to ask an initial question just to help transition in terms of your role on the council. Clark?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for sharing your story with us, Mr. Cumberbatch. So you previously talked a lot about wanting to be more vocal, and wanting to leave behind this legacy. And so I'm wondering, for you, what is your current role kind of focused in on as a senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice? And where does your legacy fit into that mission and focus?
Yeah, sure. My one of the main reasons I was brought onto the council is to try to bridge the advocacy community, particularly the formerly incarcerated advocacy community, to use the tools of data and research in their advocacy efforts. Unfortunately, what we see is, for valid reason, when we see advocates who are directly impacted by any issue, it is a very deep personal one for them because they themselves may have been exposed to some level of injustice, and therefore it kind of elicits this kind of visceral and guttural reaction to whatever the issue is. And stopping that person and trying to say, hey, but look at the data and look at the research, it's hard for them to digest that. So what the council does is we look at, we use data and research, we put forth policy recommendations that we are trying to arm the advocacy community with, so that their wins could really be systemic. And so, for example, when we talk about chokeholds, undoubtedly, I don't think that we need to talk very long about why that is a bad thing, why any chokehold or restrictive hold should not be a tool that police use because of not only the deaths of George Floyd and others, because we don't want our police to be using dehumanizing tactics like that on regular average day, Jane and Joe. So yes, we should aim to ban chokeholds, but the reality is that less than 1% of people in this country who die at the hands of law enforcement die because of restrictive holds. As a matter of fact, almost 30% of them die because of vehicular accidents, because of vehicular chases. And so, if we are going to say that we want police to not lead to the killing of citizens, then we have to say, yes, ban chokeholds. However, that is a foothold in an advocacy strategy, not the end goal. Unfortunately, what we saw was that many places were very quick to say, let's ban chokeholds. Some states said, let's ban chokeholds. And everyone packed up and went home and said, we did policing reform this year. The reality is that the systemic issues are still at play. And we at the council did that data crunch and we did that research. We were trying to arm advocates as best as we can. And we did arm some of them over the summer to try to be more effective in their advocacy approach.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, Mr. Cumberbatch. I'm going to call you that and bounce back and forth between that and Khalil. When we're looking at the role of social justice advocates in this space, we often focus on some of the issues such as chokeholds and things like that. But if we were to pull back and I were to ask you from either the Council on Criminal Justice perspective or other social justice advocates, would it be helpful to have a clearer view on really what the modern role of policing should be within our societies with regard to public safety and in our society today? Do you have a perspective on that? Does the council have a perspective on that? Because I think being able to frame the conversation around, well, it's 2021, what should the role of policing actually be in our society? We know we want safety, we know we want security, but then what is the role of police as civil servants in that sort of a system? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah. Well, the council is not an advocacy organization, so we don't take particular positions on issues. I just need to say that as our kind of as our blanket statement. But personally, as someone who has interacted with police, not only as someone who has been arrested by them, but someone who has worked with them to try to think about reforms and ways of implementing them. I think ultimately a modern day role of police is to facilitate safety and justice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be the ones in community. That doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be the ones who are making arrests. The reality is that communities, if given the right resources, from my perspective, have the ability to maintain safety and justice themselves. However, what that would mean is that police would also have to be open to the notion of working themselves out of a job. What we've seen now, unfortunately, is not only the heavy militarization of law enforcement agencies all across the country, but we've also seen the political power of them grow as well. And we cannot have a conversation about policing and policing reform and the future of policing without acknowledging the stronghold that police unions hold, not only on their rank and file officers, but also on elected officials, and how they sway and use that power to basically get what they want, to avoid what they don't want, which is that they don't want to lose people in their ranks, and they want to maintain a kind of autonomy that is separate and apart from the executive and the legislative branch, to be honest with you. We recently saw in some major cities across the country, in New York City in particular, we've also seen some states do this. They're getting rid of this thing called qualified immunity, which I know we're not necessarily going to get into. But that has caused an uproar with regular rank and file officers. And the unions are really pushing back at ways to kind of roll back some of those changes, but also stop some of those changes from happening in other states that are thinking about doing the same. So again, we can't remove the conversation of police unions from what we see what we see or what we hope to see in the future of policing. But I think ultimately, I would love to see a police body say that, we're here to facilitate the process. And that means that we will take the lead from community members, leaders in the community, because every community has them. And we're here to play a role that they want us to play. But unfortunately, as we know, that sounds like a pie in the sky dream, because it would require some humility. And honestly, it would require some selflessness.
Thank you, Mr. Cumberbatch. So you talk a lot about, we just mentioned, qualified immunity and police unions. And so I think it's important for us now to go to more of a historical context so we can really see kind of the deeper effect on that. And so I'm wondering, historically, when we're speaking about policing and social justice, what are the core issues that we have struggled with as a society, over time? And how do those different things like, qualified immunity and police unions and kind of their role within our, government structures, how does that, play into it?
Yeah, well, if I can, I'll start with the second part of that question. Qualified immunity, mens rea, a ton of other kind of judicial decisions have basically insulated law enforcement officials, particularly rank and file officers, from any level of personal accountability, not only, from the quote unquote criminal justice system, but also from, any liability as relates to lawsuits. Personal assets are protected. Basically, if they say that this was done in the line of duty, in the interests of justice, this person is completely insulated from any level of accountability. So we have to acknowledge that the rolling back of qualified immunity is a beginning change in this narrative that police need to be above and beyond protected in ways that other fields just don't. We look at the medical field, for example. If a doctor performs some level of malpractice, that person can go after that doctor, can get their certification taken away, so on and so forth. It's not, unfortunately, the same, and it's not as easy to do that with law enforcement. So I think that there are a slew of judicial decisions that need to begin to really be rolled back. And again, the removal of qualified immunity in some states, let alone some local municipalities and other big cities, is one step in the right direction. In terms of historical context, I think that we have to acknowledge that communities are struggling with what the reality is. And the reality is that, they have limited options, right? I talk frequently about my experience of having the police called on me. And the first, dozen or so times that I can remember that, all happened within the community of South Jamaica, Queens. And so by the time that I committed my crime on 96th Street and Park Avenue, which is a completely different neighborhood than South Jamaica, Queens, the police that were called on me there, I can only assume were called on me by white neighbors. And so I say that to say that our community members, people of color, would love an option to exercise that doesn't require the calling of 911. The reality is that I would assume many of my neighbors at the time who called police on me, it wasn't because I was doing anything criminal. It was because I was hanging out in front of their home. I was being loud. I was being, a young man and talking aggressively. Didn't mean any harm to anyone. But all they wanted me to do was just leave from in front of their property. And the only option that they had to ensure that happened was to call the police. And so we have to acknowledge that. We have to assume that there are communities who, yes, they don't want other George Floyd incidences happening across the country, but at the same time, they need viable options that they believe and that they see as viable, that give them the result that they are looking for, which all too often is not an arrest. It basically is, please get these, get these young men away from my home, or tell them to move someplace else. Not necessarily that they're committing any crime. So I would say that's one of the biggest struggles, is that we have to acknowledge that there are community members who do want a option, but the reality is that we need to build an option for them and make it viable in their eyes.
But part of the struggle, Khalil, and the challenge is that all of these different perspectives on the role of police in our society and in our communities are often very different and very, I'm using no pun intended, colorized by our lived experience as people of color, people who come from other countries, or what have you. There was a Pew Research survey that was done about a month before Mr. Floyd's death, and it found that 78% of Americans overall said they had a fair amount of confidence in the policing that was happening in their communities, and that policing was done in the best interest of the public. It's going to come as no surprise that of that 78%, a far smaller number of those folks were Black people who did not have that same perspective. And so our communities in some areas are still segregated, and some they are very mixed, but we still have these very divergent perspectives that we are wrestling with as a society. So when we say community leaders should, and like, who are we talking about? Who and how do we begin to engage people in these conversations? And I keep lifting it up to say policing, right, as a thing, right? Because that is the system and structures that we're talking about, that individuals are operating within. So how do we begin to really wrestle with those divergent perspectives and lived experiences that keep colliding in these spaces? Do you have a thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, you hit the nail on the head, Karen. You can't have this conversation without acknowledging race and acknowledging the role that race plays in, historical injustices like redlining and under-resourcing and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that, we need to acknowledge that, when we say policing, as you said, right, it's like we say the criminal justice system. The reality is that we're talking about thousands of little systems all across the country that differ not only in geographical location, but also in the culture in which policing and criminalization is actually placed in. The South has a completely different context when it comes to these issues than, for example, the Midwest. And so I think we need to undoubtedly start there. There are about 18,000 or so kind of law enforcement entities, national, federal, local, state, so on and so forth. So when we talk about policing in communities, and we talk about policing in communities of color, there is undoubtedly a kind of geographical context and historical context linked to that geographical context that we can't ignore. But I will say that for the most part, one of the kind of key components that needs to happen, particularly in communities of color, is that there needs to be an acknowledgement that these communities, one, have all of the kind of community kind of personnel that they need to basically manage themselves. Everyone knows this, and we've seen some big cities actually acknowledge this, LA being one of them, right? They acknowledge that there are certain quote unquote gang leaders who are basically the shot callers, right? Like if we want to know what's happening in the neighborhood and we want to try to quell something, it's not about, quote unquote snitching, but it's about going to the elders and saying, we know that you have the power to stop this, and we're asking you to stop it. We will, facilitate a process as much as you want us to, but the reality is that we need your help in order to stop particular things from happening. Similar approaches needs to happen all across the country. We're seeing in cities like New York and Chicago, and to some extent in LA and some other smaller cities across the country, the funding of programs that are largely focused on gun violence and largely focused at stopping gun violence before it happens. But the way that happens is acknowledging that there are folks who are better messengers than policing in those communities, resourcing those programs, i.e. giving those people a paycheck to, basically do what we've all seen done in communities of color for decades, which is basically to stop beefs from happening from or circumstances from boiling over before they do. I remember when I was a young kid, I was 13 or 14 and growing up in South Jamaica, it was summertime, it was hot, and it was a big, gathering, and we were all arguing. And, there was just one kind of OG, he was in the neighborhood, and everyone knew he was the one. And he came up, and this is exactly what he said. We were all yelling, and he came up and he walked up and he's looked at everyone and he said, "Bye." And everyone left. No one questioned him. No one said, it was like, okay, going home now because so-and-so said bye. And, I would argue and say that in communities of color all across the country, there is that person. Now, it doesn't always have to be, excuse me, it doesn't always have to be a male figure. We all know that there are maternal figures in the neighborhood that if Auntie so-and-so see me acting a fool, oh my God, I can never look her in the face again, and you don't display certain behaviors. So, we have to acknowledge, so I think that police have to be able to acknowledge that they have these resources in the communities. They have to, be willing to, as I said, play a facilitating role, which is extremely hard for policing. They have to, in the end, be the ones who are going to be held accountable in the public sphere for things like crime and other issues. And so it's tough, but the reality is that, and I will say that we are seeing a trend all across the country, particularly in communities that are being heavy hit by some of the deep-rooted violence issues, particularly as it relates to guns. But we are seeing those local municipalities taking risks with programs, and they've seen benefits, maybe not to the liking of community members and some law enforcement officials, but we are seeing some risks being taken, and we are seeing some benefit coming from that.
Thank you.
We're gonna take questions shortly. So if people have questions that they want to ask, we'd ask you to start populating the Q&A with that. Clark?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cumberbatch. And, I want to continue this discussion on, programs and alternative kind of options to policing, especially when we're thinking about the Human Rights Watch, who just kind of put out some recommendations last year on what local, state, and federal governments in the United States should move to, regarding policing and rethinking public safety. And so one of the three critical areas that they talk about is, one, reducing the role of police in addressing societal problems. The second is investing in communities to advance public safety and equal rights. And the third is developing independent accountability and oversight mechanisms. So I want to get your perspective on each of these three areas and where you think we can go forward.
Yeah, I mean, the Human Rights Watch is obviously a well-respected entity. And so I say this with, a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for them and the work that they're doing. If you look at some reports from, 25, 30 years ago, they essentially say the same thing, is that, policing has gotten to a point where, it's too big and it's too militarized. And, the reality is that there needs to be other components added to make sure that we're kind of, watering down the power that the policing apparatus has. The reality is that we have built a machine around policing that was not built overnight. It's not going to be dismantled overnight. Unfortunately, where issues like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others are kind of key moments where we can highlight, kind of clear failures in policing. But the reality is that there are thousands of cases that happen with law enforcement interaction daily where law enforcement has stepped out of its place and it's acted too aggressively towards someone. So we need to be willing to say, as a society, that the current apparatus that we've built, it's not working in the way that we intended to, or it's not working in the way that we want it to. And then we have to be willing to say, well, we need to dismantle that while we're building something else. And, this kind of whole kind of conversation around defund is a part of that, which is basically saying, let's remove resources, particularly financial resources, from law enforcement coffers into other sectors that will help to address other social justice ills, particularly homelessness and so on and so forth. Now, you think about how that defund police kind of conversation, it caused a huge wedge among communities of color, but also communities all across the country. That right there shows you how deeply rooted this whole notion of the need for the current apparatus that we have still exists. That was a test to say, some societies, some communities, and not all suburban rural communities, some communities, that are within the cities all across this country, they're not ready to have a true deep rooted conversation about what can we build as an alternative. One of the key things I think needs to happen in order for that to become a reality are things like removing qualified immunity. The whole trial of former officer Derek Chauvin is a moment. I think it was Reverend Al Sharpton who said, Chauvin is on trial. Chauvin is in a courtroom, but America is on trial. Because what we're really seeing is the testing of this notion, how insulated can an officer be when they do something brutal, but they do it in the line of duty? How far will the system go to protect that person in order to hold the line? And so, I don't think we're anywhere near the point where we as a community can say that some of those things that Human Rights Watch laid out can happen. We may all acknowledge that it needs to happen. But the road to making it actual reality is one that is still largely undefined in front of us.
Well, let me nudge on that a little bit, because I think when you look at social change and civil rights movements over time, there are always the conditions that existed for a very long time. And in preparation for this evening, we looked at a lot of what you were just talking about, the reports from 1970 that if I read to you, they would sound like the reports from 2021. The reports from 1920, 1930, that sound like the reports from 2021. So we're in agreement with that. But even as we think about sort of the civil rights struggle of Black Americans, right, there were issues that people had talked about literally for hundreds of years, but there are tipping points and there are critical moments when reforms can happen or when things can move forward. So given that, and given what might be a moment, we won't know, only history can judge that. I do want to ask about and get your thoughts on some of those notions of around the idea of reducing that role and reducing, what has been given to a civil servant body that has a lot to do with societal problems. So whether we're talking about people who are dealing with addictions, or we're dealing with mental health issues, often in our education systems, we're putting policing into all of these kinds of spaces. And is there an opportunity actually to reduce that role? Do you think there's an opportunity, or do you think the public will is just not there yet?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, obviously we have an opportunity, not only because of the current kind of cases that are in front of the public eye, again, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. But also, the global pandemic of COVID-19 has really forced, particularly in some of the big cities across the country, local municipalities to really think about how they are allocating resources. And we've seen some of this over the later part of last year, where we were seeing some removing of budget items from policing coffers. I think that the public will is the hardest part of this. It's deeply rooted in, as Khalil laid out, it's historically rooted in this kind of notion that if you don't have the apparatus of policing as we know it, the boogeyman will come out and get you. And the only thing that will stop the boogeyman is this sheer force, this sheer show of force that will help to deter some of the crimes that we see plague cities all across the country. The reality is that that's just not true. We need to battle against a deeply rooted narrative that, again, is deeply tied to slavery in this country. It's deeply tied to brutality in this country, and is deeply tied to systemic racism in this country. All of which are conversations that we're getting much better as a country in having, but we're just not there as yet. I think one of the key components that anyone who is eligible to vote can do is to really pay attention to local elections. And as cliche as that sounds, the reality is that we know that we're not talking about one system, as I had said earlier. We're talking about thousands of systems all across the country. What that means is that the power of those systems is largely local. For the most part, district attorneys all across the country are elected, and yes, district attorneys operate outside of policing apparatus, but district attorneys can change the culture of policing, particularly in the way that they prosecute police officers for misconduct. When they say things like, we're no longer going to prosecute low-level possessions of marijuana, even if the state does not have legalization, what do you think will happen in line? Police officers will stop arresting people for low-level amounts of marijuana. But also, mayoral candidates. I think that mayoral candidates need to be questioned more and more about their pick of police commissioners, sheriffs all across the country. There are a wave of now growing quote unquote progressive sheriffs who are basically acknowledging, look, the current way in the current way that we operate is not falling in line with being a true civil servant, and they want to actually change that. So I think that's one key thing that people can do. And again, it sounds cliche, but the reality is that, politics is extremely local, and so is the power of that politics. And the only way that we're going to change policing is by making sure that our elected officials are in line with our ideological thought and our ideological representation of the policing apparatus.
Yeah, the citizenry really does matter at the very, 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 very local level. We have some questions that are coming in, and thank you to Lala and Nikki and for curating them. And so I'm getting them on my text right now. So the first one is, you touched on this, but one of our colleagues is asking, what are some examples of effective community programs that offer some viable alternatives to policing? So some of you touched on it a little bit, but can you get more specific? Because the question is, who can we learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cure violence model is probably one of the best, and that is essentially a model that says that there are programs that exist within communities, particularly communities that are plagued by gun violence, and we will have what they call interrupters, whether they call them violence interrupters, street interrupters, and basically these are people who look the same, talk the same as the individuals who are known to carry guns in a neighborhood, and they basically try to mitigate what we would call beefs in the street before they actually reach to the level of gun violence. If gun violence does happen, they are all too often the first ones on the scene, and they're trying to mitigate any retaliation that may come out of that gun violence. That is a model that I would say over the last 6 or 7 years has really just sprung in not only its effectiveness, but also in the way that it's funded. I keep talking about funding because we can't have these bold ideas and not match them with resources. I think another model is the law enforcement assisted diversion, also commonly referred to as the LEAD model, which is basically saying that, you know, when someone calls 911, law enforcement doesn't, you know, police don't always have to be the first on scene because, you know, all too often it's not a crime it's not a crime in process. And so, you know, if you're sending someone who is a hammer, for the lack of a better term, everything looks like a nail. And so if someone is having a mental health disturbance or mental emotional breakdown, that person doesn't need to be handcuffed and a bag placed over their head. That person probably needs a social worker or someone else who is equipped and with skills that are different than a law enforcement official. And so I think those are two that, you know, oh, and then the last thing I'll say about LEAD is that we're seeing different versions of LEAD happening all across the country, where now, even in New York City, there's a pilot program, and I think it's getting ready to launch in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken, that basically said that there will be an alternative to 911. So if someone is having a mental health breakdown, we won't even insert that into the 911 system. There's going to be a separate call line that is going to be dealt with a level of priority, just like 911, but it's going to be staffed with different resources and different players who when they do respond, it's not in this kind of, you know, training of everyone is a threat and how do we assess the level of threat. It's really to give someone the help that they actually need.
Thank you, Mr. Cumberbatch. So we have one of our attendees here, and they have two related questions. So the first one is, what role do judicial practices / systems play in upholding the status quo of policing and police departments? And in return, how do advocates contextualize the judicial and federal branch of our local governments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, qualified immunity is one prime example of that. You know, that's largely based on a Supreme Court ruling, I think from 1963, that basically dealt with, I think 12 quote unquote unnamed, Bureau of Firearms. I forgot the kind of acronym, but basically what it says is that those 12 folks, you know, acted aggressively during their kind of role as bureau officials, and therefore they are protected from any kind of personal liability. You know, that was a judicial decision that qualified immunity kind of came out of that, and you know, qualified immunity is largely costing cities and states across the country millions of dollars. Right before this talk, I looked at what that number was for New York City alone. And from wrongful convictions / kind of, you know, civil suits that came out of police brutality claims, cost the city $237 million. $237 million that were paid out because of police misconduct. And those officers are probably still on the force. Maybe they're not on the beat, but they're still on the force more than likely. And if they're not, they probably will still get a pension, all still costing the system money. And so, you know, the role that judicial plays is unfortunately very key. You know, the whole issue now with Derek Chauvin is, again, you know, this is something that we need to pay attention to, because I think it's going to be our modern day Rodney King trial, where we're actually seeing a law enforcement official being, you know, some level of accountability is being sought. What happens with that will largely, I think, help to kind of pave the way for more rolling back of qualified immunity, or it, you know, if it doesn't go the way that a lot of folks hope, it will only encase and it only enshrine even more the whole notion of qualified immunity, because what they're going to say is, see, you know, he was taken to trial, he was proven innocent. And so that's the reason why things like qualified immunity and judicial decisions like it are need to be upheld and not tampered with.
So we only have a few minutes left. I do want to ask this last question, though, and get a brief response from you on this. Communities are not disempowered. Oftentimes, as you noted, communities have so many assets, so much strength, so much knowledge, so much wisdom. What can be done, or what are your thoughts about ways of building capacity within communities, whether they're urban communities or rural communities. What can be done to strengthen communities' capacities to have more agency in issues that matter, issues like policing?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more community members given an opportunity to run for local office. You know, that process is wrought with paperwork, financial burdens that fall on the candidate. You have to be willing to kind of open themselves up to this level of public scrutiny. So I would love to see that. I would love to see this kind of road being better paved for local community members, young local community members, to run for local office and to actually be elected and trusted in that seat. The other thing is that New York City has this thing called participatory budgeting, which basically allows community members who are in particular districts, irregardless of their status of citizenship or not, to be able to vote on how certain money will be spent in their community. So they're given 3 options. They say, do you want us to, fix the park? Do you want us to fix this elevator at the local, MTA station? Do you want us to pave this road? Do you want us to give the school this thing? And they're actually able to make that decision on how that money will be how that money will be spent. And again, it's not based on citizenship, because that's another thing we didn't get a chance to talk about is, we talk about voting, but you have to be a citizen. You have to be registered in order to vote. And so participatory budgeting is another example of how we're giving every community member a voice in a participatory process to be able to say how certain money will be spent. And then lastly, I would love to see local police departments really finding ways to tap into young folks in the community, not in a way that is, about snitching and telling me what's happening in the community, but really in a way that just breaks down this barrier that I think unfortunately exists. Because I will say there are a ton of well-intentioned police officers that go to work every day with the goal of trying to engage in a good way with community. But there is a whole narrative that they also have to battle that comes with them just wearing a uniform. And I remember as a young man of color, you couldn't get me to talk to a police officer. Even if I was going in a police precinct and I needed a police report for a car accident I got into, I didn't want to tell them more than I needed to. And it was because of this notion. And as much as the officer was trying to help me, this is a true story, by the way, I just had this level of, distrust that existed simply from just getting a piece of paper. So I would love to see, ways and, and this part, I don't have a silver bullet answer, but I would love to see this kind of, this communication being better kind of fostered and cultivated between young community members and policing departments all across the country.
Thank you for that. Clark?
Thank you. And, first I want to say thank you all for attending this timely conversation. And a special thank you to Mr. Khalil Cumberbatch for taking the time to provide us with his perspective on policing in America. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the space and time that we are in. Our university, often dubbed Slavery's University, was created with the sole intent to preserve a slave-holding society. Many of our founders and donors of our university were either slave owners, individuals who subscribed to racist ideals, and those who directly benefited from legacies of slavery, including convict leasing. As we begin our journey in reckoning with the history of our university, we must look toward measures of reparations and restorative justice to truly make amends. Tonight, we did just that. This program was paid for by a grant funded by the Jesse Ball duPont Fund. The namesake of our library and a staunch supporter of segregation. The 213A Leaders Program and the NAACP unit of the University of the South as a collective has committed to providing educational opportunities around the legacies of slavery as a form of restorative justice. We will continue our efforts to raise awareness around societal inequities facing BIPOC communities and will serve as a resource for our campus community. As we approach a year since the widespread Black Lives Matter protests that occurred last summer, we encourage our peers and participants of this program to continue their education around policing in America. For your benefit, we've created a list of resources to accompany you in this effort. As we end our program tonight, I leave you with a quote from the great John Lewis, who tweeted right before his death, "Do not get lost in the sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." Thank you and good night.